The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Louise Spear-Swerling. She is a professor emerita at Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven, Connecticut. Her research interests focus on children's reading development and literacy difficulties. And as you heard, her research on teacher knowledge, along with Susan Brady and Margie Gillis and others, has been instrumental in shaping how we think about the science of reading and how we can translate that and impact children in our classrooms. And in particular, do that by changing the knowledge and practices of teachers who are delivering that instruction to those children in those classrooms. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce her because there was a question earlier that I didn't get to ask Louisa, I'm sorry, and it was kind of a fun one to do, which is what are her top 5 go-to books. And I will say that one of my top 5 go-to books is a book that is published and written by our next speaker, and it is our RTI profiles. And as I've been building out teacher training that I do across the country, I've been relying on that heavily, as well as another 4 or 5 other books, one of them being from Louisa Moats, another being from Marcia Henry, one being from Wanzak et al. In their intensive interventions, just to name a few. But that RTI profile book is a great one. So I think it's a great honor to be able to introduce her and provide this service to you for free based on the sponsorship that we got from our corporate and nonprofit sponsors, as well as the giving that we have from the Fox family. I can't wait to hear and learn from Dr. Spear-Swerling, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm honored to be here. I really appreciate your invitation to speak with such illustrious co-presenters and to such a wonderful, diverse audience. It was amazing to see in the chat people from all over the world. So I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm going to be talking about structured literacy and particularly how it compares to how children are commonly taught to read, particularly in general education settings. And I thought I would contextualize this by talking just a little bit up front about children with dyslexia, because I know many people in the audience have a particular interest in individuals with dyslexia, and how structured literacy practices are a particularly good fit for them, although not only for them, and how I'll spend more time in the talk talking about how general education reading practices are often a particular disaster for individuals with dyslexia. So I thought I would begin by telling you about my uncle. This is a picture of my uncle with his younger sister, Georgette, who was my mother, circa 1945. I think this was around the time my uncle came home from World War II. And what's relevant about my uncle's story to what we're talking about today is that my uncle never learned to read. And I remember being told as a child not to ever ask him to read to me. Because he couldn't read. So his reading level was extremely low. He nevertheless made a reasonable living. He was a skilled builder. He worked in construction. He worked in the textile mills. And in the 40s and the 50s, times were different, obviously, from how they are today. And the demands on having high levels of literacy were not quite the same as they are today. But nonetheless, I'm sure my uncle's reading difficulties were a great source of pain for him, and certainly a great source of difficulty. And I often think of him that we know so much more today, and he could be helped today in ways that were not feasible in the when he was a child in the 20s and the 30s. So key features of dyslexia are the central problem is learning to decode and spell printed words. Most cases of dyslexia, though not all, are based in phonological processes. Students with dyslexia typically have broad oral language comprehension that is in average range or better, and their broad intelligence is also typically average or higher. Students can have specific cognitive weaknesses in areas such as working memory, but broad intelligence, broad language comprehension is typically an average range or higher. Dyslexia involves an unexpected reading difficulty. A lot of educational guidelines have this unexpectedness component, and that comes from research and thinking about dyslexia that's very old. And so the idea of unexpectedness is that the children's reading difficulty is not primarily due to another disability or to experiential factors such as English learner status, limited experience with language literacy, or inadequate instruction. And my uncle, in fact, had one of these complications. He and my mother and the rest of their siblings were native French speakers because my grandparents came from Quebec, and they came down to the United States around the turn of the 20th century to work in the textile mills when they could no longer make a living farming in Canada. And so my uncle was bilingual. And I'm sure this was kind of a complication for him, and it didn't help when he was learning how to read. But I don't think that being a French speaker was the primary reason for his reading difficulty, because he became fully bilingual in French and English, and all of his siblings learned to read without, great difficulty. I think there was something else going on in his case that was most likely dyslexia. So in dyslexia, the core deficit is relatively circumscribed, but can have secondary effects on many areas. If you can't read the words, you can't have good reading comprehension. Spelling difficulties typically accompany the word reading difficulties, so that affects written expression. Content learning is affected when children can't read materials that they're supposed to read for content learning. And motivation is affected in many children because repeated failure is not motivating. So reading comprehension is usually good in texts that the student can decode well. And this is a very common disability, 1 in 20 children, even by more conservative estimates. Some estimates are much greater than that. But even if you accept the 1 in 20 estimate, that means that the typical general education teacher will see at least one child like this in a classroom on average, year after year. And of course, special educators and reading specialists will see many more. We know from research that effective features of intervention for students with dyslexia do not appear to involve a qualitatively different approach to intervention than what is needed by other poor decoders, but these children often need significantly more intensity. And intensity is often operationalized as more instructional time, smaller group size, more teacher scaffolding, more practice. Key needs for this population are highly explicit, systematic instruction in phonemic awareness, decoding, and spelling. We also know that ample practice reading text is another key component of effective interventions, and early identification and intervention are very important to good outcomes. And probably one of the best examples of that is research that we have on outcomes for accuracy of reading as opposed to fluency of reading. So in some early studies, Joe Torgerson and his colleagues showed that if you have a more preventive approach where children don't build up a big deficit in word reading, you can avoid, at least in their studies, they were able to avoid the some of the fluency impairments that you see in older children with very long-standing reading problems. I think we can improve accuracy often to grade expectations in children of almost any age, but getting fluency to improve greatly can be hard in the older students with long-standing decoding problems. The features of intervention that I've just touched upon and that Louisa talked about this morning in much more depth are consistent with structured literacy. And furthermore, many poor readers have problems similar to those seen in dyslexia and can benefit from similar types of intervention. So as Tim suggested, I have an interest in poor readers with different profiles of reading difficulty. And so after looking at some of this research on different types of reading problems across grade levels, there are some statistics that surprised me a little bit, just in terms of how great the percentage of poor readers with decoding problems is. So children, Leach, Scarborough, and Rescorla, in their early study, which was an influential study on reading profiles, showed that children who are identified as poor readers in kindergarten through grade 3, 95% of these children's reading problems were due partially or entirely to poor decoding. Partially could be that the student also had an accompanying problem in comprehension that went beyond decoding. But decoding was almost a universal component of reading difficulties in the early grades. Even in children identified in grade 4 to 5, about 2/3 had problems that were partly or entirely due to poor decoding. And even as children were getting into upper elementary and middle school, Katz and his colleagues showed that almost half were children who had a decoding component to their reading difficulties. Now, not all of these children would meet criteria for dyslexia or should be considered dyslexic, but they would certainly benefit from the emphasis on, teaching of highly structured teaching of phonemic awareness and phonics and those areas, foundational reading skills. Also, sub-poor readers do have problems that are based entirely in comprehension. They decode well, but their reading difficulties involve typically language comprehension. And these children also may benefit from the explicit systematic teaching that is characteristic of structured literacy, for instance, in areas such as vocabulary, text structure, and other aspects of comprehension. Dyslexia and other reading problems emerge in an educational context. Not always in the primary grades, but often. So it's important to consider what types of typical literacy practices these children experience. We can identify risk for reading problems before children enter school, but usually children are not identified with dyslexia and their problems emerge as a reading problem in the early grades. So that what they have experienced in their general education reading instruction is an important thing to consider. So how is phonics often taught? We know that this is not the only critical area for these students, but it's one critical area. Well, when I talk to school districts, one of the things that I often hear, even from people that are not doing the best job in providing core reading instruction, is usually something along the lines of, well, we teach phonics. And it is true that phonics is usually included in instruction, but one of many problems is it's often not emphasized even for beginners. So in one popular reading program, it's one of 8 areas taught, even in grade 1, even in the grade, the earliest grades where developing foundational reading skills is key to the rest of the child's reading development. It doesn't get a heavy emphasis. Often the phonics teaching is not highly explicit or systematic, and Louisa certainly gave some good examples of that. I'll give a couple of others. Children may be expected to read words with common vowel patterns, words such as salt, fright, or work, when they have not learned the sounds for the relevant patterns, vowel patterns like ALT or IGH, or vowel R patterns like WOR. Children may also be expected to spell words with common suffixes like flipped or shady when they can't yet spell the base word, flip and shade. Word walls are very commonly used in our classrooms, and Louisa had an example of those as well. And usually they highlight common words, so the word patterns and word regularity vary so greatly that inferring phonics relationships would be very difficult or impossible. So consider this sample grade 1 word wall for the letter B, which I pulled off the web. And the words are common words like bee, bin, best, big, boy, brother, and bird. But if we think about the patterns in these words, B is an open syllable with a long vowel. Bin is usually taught as an irregular word, unless you're Canadian, sometimes they say bean. Best is a closed syllable, short vowel word with an ending blend. Big is a closed syllable, a CVC word, so we might think we're onto a pattern here, but then we have boy, which is a vowel team, not a CVC word, but it's likely to look like a CVC word to a beginning decoder. Brother is another irregular word, and bird has a single vowel and might be thought to have a short vowel by a beginning decoder, but it's actually a vowel R word and can't be decoded with a short vowel. So if you think about this for a child who is a beginning decoder, particularly in a classroom where maybe phonics teaching is highly incidental or doesn't get a lot of emphasis, think about how difficult it would be for the student to try to infer phonics relationships from these kinds of examples of words. And the conclusion the child might come to is, there is no pattern, so I might as well not try. Another issue with phonics in typical literacy practices is that initial phonics instruction may heavily emphasize a large unit approach, such as word families. I remember this with my own children who are now grown, but they learned to read in the heyday of whole language, and they would come home with these rings of words where there would be word families like back, sack, pack, track, shack, and so on, and that was supposed to be their study of phonics. And if you've done this with children, you see what they often do is once they know what the rhyme is, they just look at the first letter of the word. And this is a really maladaptive type of habit to foster in beginning decoders, because of course it's very important to look at all of the letters in the word. Also, this kind of approach doesn't incorporate phoneme blending or phoneme segmentation, both important phonemic awareness skills in these early stages of learning how to read. Let me say a little bit, this sort of a brief digression on different phonics approaches that I think will be, there's going to be a point to this if you just give me a moment. So in an analytic or analogy phonics type of approach, the initial focus is on analyzing whole words, and these are often highly patterned words. So for example, children would learn highly patterned words like back, sack, shack, and then they're expected to decode stack, if that's an unfamiliar word, by analogy or by comparison to these known words. And the early known words are usually taught by sight, but they're highly patterned. So it's supposed to facilitate inferring phonics relationships. In an onset rhyme phonics approach, the initial focus is on learning sounds for common onsets and rhymes and how to blend them. So So the onset is the consonant or consonants that come before the vowel in the syllable. And the rhyme is the vowel and everything that goes to the end of the syllable. So children would be learning onsets such as ST says st, CH says ch, FL says fool, and then they would learn common rhymes such as ack, ill, and ache. And so the logic of this is it's easier to blend because the child is only learning two parts. To read stack, they're blending st, ack, stack. In a synthetic phonics approach, the initial focus is on learning grapheme-phoneme relationships and how to blend phonemes into whole words. So you're learning, the child is blending at the phoneme level from the start, from the early stages. And this does make some demands on phoneme blending skills, but it has the advantage of really forcing children to pay attention to all of the letters in the word. And if you use one of the other approaches, children ultimately have to make a transition to being able to blend phonemes anyway, because children are not going to be able to read words like transportation by an onset rhyme approach or analytic approach. So one of the things I sometimes hear from people is that, well, the NRP report, the National Reading Panel report, a very influential and important research report, didn't differentiate among these approaches. It found that systematic, explicit phonics teaching was much better than no phonics teaching or unsystematic incidental phonics, but it wasn't able to differentiate among these different phonics approaches. However, we've had 20 years of research since the NRP report, and that research favors more explicit, systematic, synthetic phonics rather than one of the other approaches. In structured literacy, phonics instruction generally uses this kind of explicit, systematic, synthetic phonics approach. So for example, to decode shack, children would learn sounds for the letter patterns, sh, ah, and how to blend them. Synthetic phonics doesn't mean that you're blending all words letter by letter, because that doesn't work very well in English. If you did that in English, shack would come out something like s, ah, k, k. Children always have to deal with letter patterns, but the point is that the letter patterns are more at the phoneme level. Instruction in phonemic awareness is also very important. And of course, as children progress beyond the earliest stages of reading, they must be taught larger units such as common vowel patterns, vowel R patterns, and common morphemes. And then further, words of more than one syllable and multisyllabic words. I sort of want to put a little bit of a plug in here for the importance of providing teachers with good materials for teaching. This is something I've seen over a long career training teachers. And so here's an example of why having good materials is important. So let's say that I'm a kindergarten teacher and I'm just beginning to teach children how to decode. And children are learning CVC with the vowel A, CVC pattern words with the vowel A. So I might pick some practice words for decoding like tap, bag, sad, cab, hat, lap, and rag, for instance. For spelling, you want to use the same category, but different practice words. So practice words for spelling might be words like tag, nap, sat, mad, etc. The teacher has to be able to filter out words like bay and jaw, which are vowel team words, but they kind of look like they're CVC words, even though they're not, or words like car, which are vowel R, and words like was, which are irregular. Because the point is to develop decoding and encoding skill on any regular word with this pattern. It's not whether the child can decode, it's not just whether they can decode and spell these particular words. And so it's very difficult for educators to teach phonics well, particularly to large groups of children or those who struggle, without good research-based phonics curricula and materials. Some schools do not provide teachers with these kinds of curricula. This may be, I'm not sure if this is more of a problem in my state than in other places, but when I do talks in other states and I talk to teachers, it's very common for them to tell me that they're not provided with these kinds of curricula and materials. And based on what we know from research on teacher knowledge and the fact that teaching word level reading skills and phonological skills is really not intuitive. It's not enough just to be, an intelligent person and a good reader yourself and warm and fuzzy with little kids. There's really knowledge that you need that many teachers are not getting. And then even if you are getting this kind of professional development, which is wonderful and very important, having good curricula and materials are important tools for teachers to have to free them up for other kinds of things like interpreting assessments and differentiating instruction for different students and not having to devise their own curricula and materials. Another problem in some classrooms involves the use of certain instructional activities that unintentionally confuse or mislead children about how to read unknown words. And Louisa talked about this one as well, the use of word configuration activities or word shapes. I was horrified recently to have a young teacher show me again, a very popular reading program where word shape activities are part of the program. Word shape is completely useless for learning to decode or spell unknown words. So in this activity, children would be given words like, for instance, rat, 8, 4, or could usually many more words than just 3 words, but I'm giving you 3 as examples. So the idea would be that the child is supposed to put 4 in the set of boxes on the left because F is a tall letter, and they're supposed to put rat in the middle set of boxes because you have 2 short letters followed by a tall letter, and 8 would go in the boxes on the far right because the tall letter is in the middle. And this is just really horrible. It's really worse than useless, because it's drawing children's attention to the wrong thing. It's kind of like teaching them that 2 + 2 = 5, or 5 + 4 = 10 in math, or something like that. And if you're not convinced, think about a word like rat. And if you focus on the configuration, well, rat could be red, or it could be cub, or it could be mob, or it could be wed, or it could be aid, or it could be eat, or art, or like a million other things. So the configuration is not helpful. So instead, how would we teach a word such as art in a structured literacy approach? Well, this is a vowel R pattern word. So the child learns that the pattern AR is associated with the sound R. And children blend art to produce art. And then this approach helps children decode many other words with similar patterns and letter sounds. And it doesn't have to just be art, cart, part, smart, like in a more, analogy or word families approach. It could be art, arc, arm, bark, lark, smart, start, hard, farm, tar, and so on. And another advantage of this is that repeated exposure to words with similar letter patterns builds automaticity. In typical literacy practices, instruction often relies on the 3 cueing systems, sometimes called MSV models of reading. And this model is truly the bane of my existence. We've had, I trained teachers for about 40 years, 4 decades, both general and special education teachers. And I've been railing against the 3 cueing systems model for at least 30 out of those 40 years. And I like to say it's kind of like Rasputin, you know, the stories about Rasputin when he was assassinated prior to the Russian Revolution. Supposedly he was poisoned, he was stabbed, he was shot, he was thrown in the river, and he just kind of kept coming back. And that's how I think of the three cueing systems model. So, okay, so for people that might not know what I mean by this model, this is based on the work of Goodman, Clay, and others. It says that children become good readers by using multiple cues to read words. And this is an important distinction. Reading it, the claim is specifically that the multiple cueing systems have to do with reading words. And the three cueing systems are meaning, structural or syntactic cues, and visual or graphophonic cues, what the rest of us would call letter sounds. If children come to a word they cannot read when reading text, they're encouraged to use partial letter cues coupled with pictures and sentence context rather than looking carefully at the word to decode it. And here are some examples of commonly taught three cueing strategies for word reading. This is from Emily Hanford's wonderful podcast, At a Loss for Words. If you are not familiar with the podcast, I urge you to check it out. It's probably the best explanation of the flaws in the three cueing model for a general audience that I have ever read. It's really, really good. So children might be encouraged to, use pictures as in legal eye, or, look at get your mouth ready for the first sound. I'm not even really sure what that one means, or skip the tricky word and read to the end of the sentence and then try to guess the meaning from context. So we have decades of scientific evidence showing that good readers do not use three cueing systems to read words. I think Keith Stanovich did some of these studies in the 1980s. It's been a really long time that we have known that it is not true that what makes you a good reader is using three cueing systems to read the words. Good reading development in the early stages of reading is really bottom up in many ways. And the children who become good readers are children who have good phonological and word decoding skills and are able to develop those skills early. A friend of mine who was a paraprofessional in a grade 1 classroom told me this story about a teacher who was a very whole language oriented teacher and had the multiple cueing strategies like the ones I just showed you posted in the classroom. And there was a child who was a particularly good reader, and the teacher highlighted the child to the class and said, Maisie is such a good reader. She knows all her strategies, at which Maisie piped up and said, I do know them, but I don't use them. When I see a word I don't know, I just sound it out. So that about sums it up. But unfortunately, some of the children don't have that realization or don't have the skills without being directly taught how to decode. So why does the three cueing systems thing matter? Why is it a problem? Because as Emily discusses in her podcast, a lot of teachers think, why is it a bad thing for children to use more than one strategy? That should be a good thing. Here's the problem, though. Encouragement to guess at words in decoding distracts children from close attention to the print. And close attention to the print is a really important habit for children in the early stages. It's really important at all stages of reading. It's just that as people advance in reading, as children advance, that process becomes more automatized. Early on, it's not really a habit that children have naturally, and it has to be fostered. So it's very problematic for developing skilled, fluent reading not to look carefully at letters in words. Also, guessing based on context does not work well for more advanced types of texts. One of the things I've seen over and over in doing consultations is that even if phonics is being taught well in one part of the reading curriculum, if children learn to guess at words when reading text, this undermines their reading progress. Also, as Barbara Foreman points out, guessing at words based on context can become a very hard habit to break. And this is especially problematic for children with dyslexia and other decoding difficulties because they have weak decoding and often are already kind of inclined to over-rely on context. And here's an example of a student on whom I did a consultation. The district asked me to do an independent evaluation on this student who had been in special education for many years. So there was a kind of a dispute between the child's parents and the district. The district thought that Jessie was, basically caught up and ready to be discontinued from special education. And the parents were concerned about Jessie's progress. And I've done a number of these types of consultations, and it can go either way. So I wasn't sure how this one was going to turn out when I first started. Just a little bit of the background about Jessie. He had a history of preschool language delay, expressive language only. He was identified quite early with dyslexia in grade 1. He had that pattern of early language abilities, oral language abilities that were weak, but where the weaknesses seemed to resolve around the primary grades. That doesn't happen for all children, but it happens for some. It's important to know those children are still at risk in reading, as Jessie was. And Jessie had had many years of structured literacy intervention since the primary grades. He had some good intervention. So when I did my evaluation, the standardized measure I used was the Wyatt, and this is a test on which the average standard scores are 85 to 150. So for listening comprehension and oral expression, his scores were solidly in average range, as I expected. Word reading was a little bit below average. This is a little low. It's around the 15th percentile for a child that's had so much intervention. I would hope for his real word reading to be a bit more solidly average, but this is a fairly common pattern in students with dyslexia, even when they've had intervention. His pseudo word decoding was better, was within average range. The Wyatt has kind of an interesting feature where you can get separate scores for rate of oral reading and accuracy. So his rate was technically within average range, but look at his accuracy. His accuracy was a standard score of 67, which is down around the first or second percentile. So accuracy was really low, and mom and dad were right. He was having significant difficulties in text reading. That was his weakest area. And he was one of those children that made, a ton of errors like off for the and this for that and mom for mother because he was over relying on context. As is the case in many schools, Jessie's school emphasized the 3 cueing systems in text reading. And in my opinion, this is probably what undermined the effectiveness of his structured literacy program in phonics. He wasn't getting the carryover to text reading. He was getting phonics instruction in special education, but when he went into his other classes, he was being encouraged to guess at words. It's very important to distinguish using context cues in decoding versus to aid comprehension. So if you, let's think about a short text like Mary has 2 cats. When they go to sleep, they like to snuggle up to each other. So consider the word snuggle. Let's say we have a child who cannot read the word snuggle. So she uses the first couple of letters combined with a picture or sentence context to try to read the word. This is using context to aid decoding. Let's say, though, we have a different situation. A child can read the text, including the word snuggle, but doesn't know what the word means. She uses sentence context or the picture to figure out that the word means to move into a warm, comfortable position. This is using context to aid comprehension. Good readers do not rely heavily on context to aid decoding, but they do use context to aid comprehension. for example, to figure out what an unfamiliar word means, not to guess at it in decoding, but to figure out what it means, or to disambiguate multiple meanings of words, things like that. So it's not a bad thing at all for teachers to encourage children to use context to figure out what a word means. You don't want to encourage them to guess at words in decoding. That's the thing that's problematic. A related problem involves the types of texts that are used for children's reading, especially in the early stages of learning to read. So children, and especially in general education classes, are often placed for text reading in predictable level text. And keep in mind, I am talking about beginners here, so kindergarten, first grade. The predictable level texts often contain many words that weak decoders are unable to decode, and this tends to foster a habit of guessing at words based on pictures or sentence context. It also means that weak decoders do not get opportunities to apply their decoding skills in text reading. So here's an example from the Reading A to Z series. This series has some very good decodables, but the ones I'm showing you are the leveled books, the leveled predictable text. So this is about a child going to school, and the first page says, I get my backpack, with a picture of a child getting her backpack. I get my pencils. I get my ruler. I get my eraser. I get my crayons. I get my sweater. So obviously what the text is fostering by this repetition of I get my, and words like crayons and sweater and eraser, which a beginning decoder is not very likely to be able to decode, is it's encouraging guessing based on the picture, because the picture shows you what the word is. But interpreting pictures is not reading. In a structured literacy approach, in contrast, beginning decoders would read texts that provide a good match to the decoding skills they have learned and that do not encourage guessing at words. And we have some really good decodables now. When I was a public school teacher, a lot of the decodables were very difficult to do anything with comprehension, ultra controlled text. And I think there's still a place for those kinds of texts. And I have seen, even with those texts, children who are poor readers be thrilled that we had kids in the fieldwork program that I run, or that I used to run, say things like, this is the first book I ever read and want to take it home. But we have a wide range now of decodables, and some of them are just really attractive and appealing to children. So this is one called the Red Fox Cub from the Right Skills Decodable series. Again, this publisher has leveled books, but this is from the decodable series, and it's approximately the same level as the Maria text that I showed you earlier. This is one from a series called the Flyleaf Books to Remember, which is a wonderful decodable series. And this would be a little bit more advanced level, maybe about mid-grade 1 level, short vowel words that include words with blends and digraphs. But there's a storyline. You can do some things with comprehension, but the child is getting practice with application of decoding. The 3 cueing systems approaches can also influence scoring of assessments, especially informal assessments of children's text reading. So in non-structured literacy practices, teachers are often trained to overlook contextually appropriate errors such as for the and this for that and mom for mother. These kinds of so-called miscues, which we should not be calling them miscues because that harks back to the 3 cueing system, but these are viewed as unimportant because they don't greatly alter meaning. Now, I think, first of all, the thing about greatly altering meaning is debatable. Maybe in very simple texts, they don't greatly alter meaning. But as children are reading more difficult books, even something like, a book versus the book. A book could be any book. The book is referring to a particular book. that has been discussed in the text, and that could have implications for comprehension, particularly if the children are making a lot of those kinds of mistakes. In contrast, in a structured literacy approach, with very few exceptions, all word reading errors count. Some exceptions are errors due to articulation, dialect, or foreign accent. Those usually are not scored as errors. So for example, if a child who has an articulation problem with R's says wabbit instead of rabbit, or a child who speaks dialect says bath instead of bath, but you know they mean the correct word, then that would not normally be scored as an error. But the other kinds of things like for the and pretty much all other word reading errors would count. And this is important because, among other reasons, accurate text reading is key for building fluency. And we know from research that minor errors do affect comprehension. Ignoring these kinds of errors in scoring assessments can provide a false picture of how well poor decoders are performing and may lead to faulty decision making, as in Jesse's case where his school thought he was doing great. Also, some instructional approaches that are popular in typical literacy practices make explicit systematic teaching extremely difficult. So one example would be Reader's Workshop. This is a model that does include some explicit instruction via mini lessons. It includes some activities from which children can benefit, like working on language, working with a partner. But there's a heavy emphasis on children working independently and in different self-selected texts with teacher guidance. There is teacher guidance. In a good model, the teacher would be guiding somewhat children's selection of texts. And then the teacher confers with students individually on their reading and their writing. Well, why is this a problem? Because, you know, it kind of sounds good. It sounds good that children get to pick their own books and, you know, children are pursuing their interests and things like that. Well, for one thing, there's limited time for explicit teaching in this model. The model really does not lend itself to systematic teaching because if each child is in a different text, then I don't know how you teach in a systematic, planned way. We sort of need something that is in between. The whole class is doing exactly the same thing, moving in lockstep with no differentiation at one extreme, and the other extreme where every child is kind of in a different book doing a different thing. And so it makes it very difficult to teach according to any kind of planful sequence. Often in this kind of model, there's not enough focused practice for the weaker readers in a class. Children do not necessarily choose the optimal texts for their own learning. And if every child is reading a different book, it's challenging for the teacher to give more than superficial input during conferences or to consistently recognize students' misunderstandings of a text. It may be hard to address higher level aspects of reading, such as building background knowledge and inferencing, if there's not a shared set of texts to discuss. And usually there's also a 3 cueing systems emphasis with this kind of model, as in one kindergarten lesson that I had where the lesson was, you can read by looking at the pictures. Also, substantial amounts of classroom time are often devoted to silent, independent reading. This is not unique to Reader's Workshop, but it's often a feature, and it's pretty common in other classrooms as well. This is not a good use of classroom instructional time, again, especially for the weaker readers in class. And let me highlight another important distinction. So it's important to make a distinction between encouraging free time, independent pleasure reading, and devoting substantial amounts of classroom instructional time to silent, independent reading. Children can derive many benefits from independent pleasure reading. So we don't want to be against encouraging reading for enjoyment and developing habits of reading. We know that independent reading can help build children's fluency, vocabulary knowledge, background knowledge, and so on. And teachers should certainly encourage this. In some ways that teachers can encourage it are to provide ample choices of texts at different levels so that children, once children are at the point where they're really able to read independently, they have a choice of interesting books that are at their reading level, that are within their abilities, assigning independent reading as homework and providing some guidance so that children aren't always selecting books that are too easy or too hard or exactly the same, the 5,000 Babysitters Club books over and over, or that sort of thing. Certainly encouraging independent reading as a free time classroom activity when children have time that is their own time. Developing book groups for older children can be a way to motivate independent reading. However, classroom instructional time is limited, and students with dyslexia and other poor readers often need substantial amounts of explicit systematic teaching in order to progress. Also, many poor decoders need to read text aloud with a teacher or a partner. They're not necessarily ready for long stretches of silent reading. In doing school consultations, usually, an observation of the child is part of it. And if I observe during an independent reading block, what I will often see if the child that I'm observing has a serious reading problem is 20 minutes of the child staring at the same page of the book, because they don't read well enough to really benefit from an extended block of independent reading. That's not to say that some poor readers couldn't benefit from that, but children that are at a very low level really need the practice of reading text aloud with a teacher or at least a partner. So the sum of all this, in summary, really, is prioritizing a large block of instructional time to silent independent reading is not a good use of time, especially for these students. I think it's arguable whether it's a good use for any students, but it's particularly not a good idea for the weaker students in a class. So you might think, this is what we think in Connecticut, at least in my experience. It's very common for officials to think that, even if we don't have an important component of literacy covered in the school's instructional model or curriculum or reading materials, we're using the Common Core standards, we're using state standards. That will ensure that it's still taught, right? Well, okay, so here's some data from a study that I did with Jamie Zabolski, who was one of the co-authors on the Anne Cunningham study that Louisa referenced earlier, where they asked teachers about their reading their preferences for teaching during a language arts block. So Jamie and I did kind of an extension of that study. And we used the same methodology involving what was called a language arts activity grid. So it was a very simple task. It's a paper and pencil planning task. And we asked a group of teachers, we said, you have a 2-hour English language arts block. Plan your block the way you think would be best, and describe the activities that you would use and how many minutes you would allocate out of the 2 minutes to each activity. And then we looked at it by grade, and we coded activities as being, phonics activities and spelling activities and different components of writing and things like that. So these are the mean responses of the grade 2 to 5 teachers. It was a small study, so there were 68 of these teachers. On average, the teachers allocated out of a 2-hour English and language arts block 5.2 minutes to spelling instruction, 4.8 minutes to vocabulary, just under 10 minutes to basic writing skills, less than 1 minute to writing processes like planning, and revision and editing, and 18 minutes to text composition, which might not sound too bad, except that the way we coded these data, we weren't necessarily discriminating whether the activities were really good activities. So I think that 18 minutes is maybe a little more optimistic than than is really warranted. I didn't make a slide for the first grade, for the kindergarten and first grade teachers, but on this planning task, we had, I think the mean amount of time allocated for phonics was about 10 minutes. The mean amount of time for phonemic awareness was maybe about 5 minutes. And there were teachers that planned no time for phonics and no time for phonemic awareness, even in kindergarten and grade 1. Now, encouragingly, we also measure teachers' knowledge using the kinds of teacher knowledge surveys that other people have used in studies. And high levels of teacher knowledge did predict time allocation plans that were more consistent with research. So teacher knowledge did make a difference. Overall, though, many teachers plan to allocate time in ways not consistent with scientific recommendations, and this was true for writing as well as reading. So overall, what this suggests is that in the absence of good research-based curricula and materials, many teachers, good reading instruction would not be systemic. Key components of literacy would be overlooked in instruction by many teachers. And whether children receive the instruction would just be dependent on, which teacher they happen to have, right? And that would be, even if children were lucky with having a particular teacher one year, those gains might be undone the following year. And really, I think that what this is saying is that good teacher knowledge and having good curricula, good materials as tools for teachers are both important. They both work together in terms of being able to produce good outcomes for children. So do some children learn to read well with typical literacy practices? Yes, some do. My children did. My children went to school in the heyday of whole language, and they both became excellent readers. I don't think they had a vulnerability in decoding, and they also had their mother slipping them phonics at home to make sure they were getting it, so I'm sure that did not hurt. But these kinds of practices are a very poor fit for students with dyslexia or other reading difficulties. Structured literacy approaches are a much better fit for these students and would undoubtedly have benefited my uncle. And if features of structured literacy were incorporated into typical literacy instruction, they could benefit many, many students, not only those with dyslexia. There's a myth that I hear in the teacher educators especially love this myth, that if you have a knowledgeable, well-trained teacher, the teacher can teach well using any method. Well, having a knowledgeable, well-trained teacher is really important, as Louisa discussed. But the problem is if we have materials and methods that work against the teacher and that make good teaching difficult, if the teacher's access to books is primarily predictable level text, if the organization of instruction in the school is a model that makes explicit systematic teaching extremely difficult, then we're going to make it hard even for well-trained teachers to do the right thing. So teacher knowledge is very important, but instructional methods are also very important. Teachers need instructional models, curricula, and materials that lend themselves to effective teaching. We should give them the tools and professional development. And I know Margie's going to be talking a lot about the professional development piece that they need to reach all children, including those with dyslexia. So to wind up here, I would like to thank Tim for his invitation and MTSU. And I thank this wonderful audience for being here and for their interest in hearing all of us speak. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Louise. We have a lot of really good questions, and I'm going to start with, I think one that I think is near and dear to my heart as a college professor, and maybe to yours too, which is people are asking, what textbooks might you recommend for undergraduate literacy and elementary school education courses?
Well, there are some really good textbooks available now. So Marty Haugen and Susan Smart have an excellent pre-service textbook that's intended for pre-service teachers.
Has my brain in it.
I know I'm not going to, I love the core materials, the core teaching reading source book. That's one that I used to use. If you look in the NCTQ, the documents, they have suggested textbooks, and I've agreed very much with their suggestions. There's some really wonderful materials. You know, obviously, Louisa has done just fabulous materials for teachers. Margie has a wonderful series, her Literacy How series, which I think is also great for teachers, very easy to understand. Margie can correct me if I'm wrong later. I think Margie's materials are maybe a little more oriented toward in-service PD, but you know, I don't see any reason why they couldn't be utilized for pre-service as well. There's some really good materials out there. Unfortunately, some of the materials that are very popular in pre-service teacher preparation, in my experience, particularly in elementary education, are, you know, they're loaded with the 3 queuing systems and not, you know, they're really problematic, and the teachers often don't get the training they need.
Right. All right, so this is a very specific, so some of these are very specific about things that you said that they want clarification on.
Sure.
So, for example, they said, why does the decodable text about the fox still have words like you, have, etc., which are non-CVC words? Which I want to let you answer since it was your example.
Yep. Okay, so whenever you're writing a text that you're trying to make decodable, it's usually hard to, it's hard to write an English sentence that doesn't have some other words in it, right? So there's always going to be some of the words that are irregular, like the, and there's words that are, you know, maybe not irregular, but the child has not learned them yet. So an example of a word like that might be, you know, dark, which is not irregular, but if a child is learning, is at the stage of just learning CVC, they haven't learned that word pattern yet. So when these texts are being written, there's sort of a trade-off. The fewer of those, the more you try to constrain the text to just CVC words, the more, you know, usually it kind of starts to sound a little more unnatural. On the other hand, and usually it's harder to do things with comprehension. Conversely, the more words you include that are irregular and don't fit the pattern, there's kind of a trade-off with the practice level that the child is getting, the amount of practice in decoding, and the difficulty level for the student if the student's decoding is very impaired. So I think that that's sort of a judgment call. I would think of decodability as being kind of a continuum.
Right.
And some, you know, years ago when I was a teacher, I used a series that had I think the series is still out there. I think it's the neurolinguistics series. There was a dog named Rags in the series, and the text was filled with sentences like Rags can wag, Rags, wags, and wags. And I had a little boy that had an articulation problem on the R, and that would come out as Wags can wag, wags, wags, and wags. And then he would look at me like I was crazy. So I think it's good to explore the range of books that are available, and you pick the one that's the right fit for a student. And I mean, I don't want people to think that I have some sort of philosophical position against the more constrained text, because some children do need those, and I have seen children, especially younger children that have had a lot of failure, just be thrilled that they can read something.
So I want to follow up on that, because part of this is a dialogue, right? And
sure.
Again, one of the things that I highlighted when we were kind of talking about some of the things that I see is that I know that sometimes people that, like you and I, who are in ivory towers, we may know about what happens in schools, and we may go out and support, and we may actually still practice a little bit. And because we're research practitioners, which I happen to be, I can research what I study, and I can practice what I can do both of them. So one of the things that I hear though is that if I were out there, I might be scratching my head, and if I were a person who was using what might be a fairly effective core program, they're going to have Dolch and Fry words. And they just might have heard Louisa talk earlier, and they may hear something from Kilpatrick, or they might find some rage tweeting that's going on out there about, we have to do it this way. You know, it's just impractical, right? So we can't write these decodable texts without using the high frequency sight words.
Right.
And so I think that acknowledging that, and I do feel that if we were not to acknowledge that, one, we know what it's like, we do these, some of us actually build these materials out, I do believe we lose credibility, right?
Sure.
Because anybody out there that actually has to do this knows that you cannot do this effectively without some of those.
Right.
So I do think that that's where some of this talking past one another and also losing credibility can come if we sound like we're just saying something that just is impractical in practice.
Right, right, absolutely.
Now, you raised something else when you said that about decoding being on a continuum, and I actually know some of the research side of this because one of my dear friends, Lori Cutting, is actually researching this and publishing work on a decoding measure to help with that. So this is related to this, but we're going to focus on the more practical side because this is to you. With balanced literacy, we report out students' reading level with levels, so these level text. If we are taking a structured literacy approach and using decodable books or somewhat decodable books, then how do we report out how students are doing? How do we actually track where they're progressing? Because, you know, the practicality is that I go into schools and I see the room that has all the readers in those little shelves. They brought all the numbers or letters or something, and they're going to them, and they're using running records and other things to help determine where those kids are. How do they work that kind of a mentality and help themselves translate into this in a realistic way?
Right. So I think that's a really good question. I always think, you know, in good assessment, you want to use multiple measures, right? So I'm not opposed to using the leveled book readers as part of an assessment system, because the way I would think of it is this is telling you how an individual child is performing relative to the expectations of a kids in general education. But you would not want to use only that type of measure. You would want to also have, you know, certainly the things that we know are really important to progress in reading, like measures of out of context word reading and decoding and phonemic awareness and oral reading fluency, things like that. So that would kind of be my solution. When I do evaluations, it's rare that I'm asked to do an evaluation on a kindergartner or first grader. Usually they're children from around grade 2 and up. But I will often use an informal reading inventory like the QRI or VRI or something like that, in conjunction with standardized tests and measures like, you know, the core phonics survey and DIBELS, and it kind of just gives you a more comprehensive picture of the student. And the reading inventories or looking in relation to levels, I would think of that as showing you how the student is doing compared to general ed expectations for text reading. But it's not going to really be interpretable without the other kinds of data that I mentioned. Correct. And it's not by itself, it's not a good indicator necessarily of the student's growth.
If I can steal 2 minutes, I want to follow up though in this dialogue, which is you kept using the word assess, 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 and that's to some who are practitioners in the classroom who aren't really allowed to do that, and you kept using that word. And level texts are often used, to help determine instructional goals and kind of instructional planning and what the material should be set. So in a lot of well-developed structured literacy programs that have a scientific basis to them, or maybe even empirical evidence to say they work, they'll have a scope and sequence for the word recognition, right? Mm-hmm. So, and they'll have supplemental tests, or they'll have progress monitoring tools that are called curriculum embedded. And those are embedded within the curriculum, and they're aligned to the scope and sequence. So we often train at our center to go in with schools, and we help them to understand that they can pull those information. So Louisa pointed out that one of the programs on her list of you could use to supplement phonics was Foundations, right? So you actually progress and you determine how a class moves in Foundations, which is an effective practice that we have evidence for. You can use those unit tests that are embedded in there. And that will help you to monitor, one, how you progress in that curriculum, and also how you would differentiate to know that there are some children who aren't teaching what you are not learning what you're teaching, and you might even gear them up for a tier 2 or some kind of a supplemental differentiated instruction. That would be what I might also add to that, because as I put my general educator hat on and I'm listening at home, I might worry that that answer was if I was trying to determine or diagnose or analyze or identify a reading disability.
Right. I agree completely. I didn't mention that, many programs will have assessments that accompany the program. So if a student is in a program like Wilson or Foundations or Wharton Gillingham or any of those kinds of programs.
CKLA in Tennessee would have those too.
Yes. You're seeing, it does give you an indicator of how the child is progressing in the program, and that certainly is very important information.
Yeah. This is fun to do this dialogue. There was a question that we do need to clarify, though, and which one was that really important? Oh, we're going to pick this one. We will have to get to secondary students at some point. So I will do that at wrap-up if you're still here, because there's been questions throughout the day about middle and secondary, and we're going to address that because that's critical. I want to talk about the use of nonsense words from an instructional standpoint. Good, bad, when do we use them? I know I have my recommendations that we use because of the structure of the language and the population of words and their frequencies.
Right. So, I've long had, and I have to say, this is not necessarily driven by evidence. It's kind of a bias that I have. I don't really like using nonsense words in instruction. Obviously, I would use them in assessment. They're really important in assessment. In instruction, I prefer to use low frequency real words. It is very important not to use, just common words all the time, because sometimes the children will know those words by sight and it gives you a false picture of their decoding. Another alternative is that you can use, parts of words. So, you can have a word like magnet broken up, where the child is reading the parts. And mag is part of a larger word. But there's so many words that real words children can't read often when they have these kinds of problems that I've tended to go toward that approach rather than nonsense words. I will say it takes a lot of skill on the part of the teacher. When with my teacher candidates, for them to do this, they had to really be able to generate, and they had to plan it in advance, be able to generate words.
Yeah, that rings true with me too.
Yeah, the nonsense words didn't always avoid that problem for me, because sometimes some of the teacher candidates would generate nonsense words that weren't really orthographically consistent with English or had some other kinds of problems with it.
I've even gone and done site visits when I've been supporting implementation in schools, and I've noticed that the real words selected, because of the lack of a depth of understanding about the English language, sometimes weren't on point. And so I remember taking Devin Kearns to see a classroom, I don't remember if it was first or second, to look at some implementation work of a program, and the teacher's word choices were so bad, and the person that was the supervisor of that school pulled him aside and said, "That is not normal. That teacher is it's like she's having an off day." But then every other class, and he actually complimented the level of instruction based off of the strong training that they had had. But I remember distinctly, it was one of the first times that Devin and I had actually met and interacted, and the poor principal, she was just petrified that Devin Kearns was there, and that horrible use of those words was presented there, because she definitely knew, with her deep training and level of certification, what was going on, and she's actually a dear friend of mine. So, but speaking of dear friends, we should probably wrap up here and let our friend Margie queue up while we go to break.
Okay, thank you so much. Break a leg, Margie.